The Roman legions had already won. Jerusalem had fallen. The Second Temple, the most sacred building in the Jewish world, standing for nearly 600 years, was ash. The war was over. 1,000,000 people dead, a people scattered, and yet, on a rock in the middle of the Judean desert, a plateau rising 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea, 960 people refused to accept that. So Rome sent 15,000 soldiers to take them, not because they needed to, not because those 960 people posed any military threat to the greatest empire in the world, but because Rome understood something that every empire eventually learns. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't an army. It's an idea that refuses to die. Here's what I want you to hold in your mind for this entire video, because this story is not what most people think it is. On the surface, Masada is a straightforward tale of heroic last stand. 960 Jewish rebels on an impregnable mountaintop fortress, holding out against the most powerful military machine in the ancient world, choosing death over slavery. A story of defiance so powerful that 2,000 years later, the modern state of Israel made it a national founding myth. Israeli soldiers were inducted into the military at the summit of Masada under the vow, "Masada shall not fall again." That is the story everyone knows, but here is what nobody tells you. Everything we know about Masada comes from a single source. A Jewish general who surrendered to Rome, became a Roman citizen, took the name of his Roman patrons, and wrote his history of the Jewish war sitting comfortably in Rome under Roman imperial sponsorship. His name was Josephus. He was not at Masada, he never visited it. He got the entire account from 2 women and 5 children who hid in an underground cistern during the final night, and who, according to Josephus's own account, could not possibly have heard the speeches he claims to quote verbatim. The defenders left no testimony. The Romans left no independent account. What we have is a story told by a man who had every reason to shape it for a Roman audience, and a nation that built its identity on that story 2,000 years later. By the end of this video, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about what happened on that mountain. And you're going to understand why the myth might be more important than the truth. To understand Masada, you first have to understand what it actually is. Because when you see it for the first time, and I genuinely encourage you to look it up, it's extraordinary, the first thing you feel is not awe. It's disbelief that human beings were up there at all. Masada is a natural mesa in the Judean desert, rising 1,300 feet above the western shore of the Dead Sea. The plateau at the top is roughly the size of 18 football fields. Its sides are sheer cliff faces of pale limestone. In the summer, temperatures on the plateau reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no natural water source, no natural shade. In every direction, nothing but desert and the glittering silver mirror of the Dead Sea far below. Herod the Great, the Jewish king who built much of what we now call ancient Israel, including the expansion of the Second Temple, chose Masada as his personal refuge, his private apocalypse bunker. Between roughly 37 and 31 BC, he transformed the plateau into one of the most sophisticated fortresses in the ancient world. Walls 6 meters thick and 12 meters high encircled the entire plateau. A 3-tiered palace hung off the northern cliff face, its lowest terrace actually suspended over the void, 1,700 feet above the desert floor. There were cisterns capable of storing 40 million liters of rainwater, storehouses packed with enough food to sustain a large population for years, a bathhouse, a swimming pool, a synagogue. Herod built Masada so that if everything else failed, if revolt, assassination, or invasion stripped him of his kingdom, he would have one place left in the world that was truly impregnable. He died in his bed. He never needed it, but someone else did. In 66 AD, a group of Jewish radicals called the Sicarii seized Masada from its Roman garrison using a ruse. They walked in pretending to be friendly, then slaughtered the soldiers inside. And here is the first uncomfortable truth of this story. The Sicarii were not the noble freedom fighters history remembers them as. The word Sicarii means daggermen. They were urban terrorists, named for the short daggers they concealed under their cloaks, and used to assassinate Roman collaborators and Jewish moderates in crowded marketplaces. They were so extreme, so violent, that the mainstream Jewish revolutionary movement in Jerusalem, the Zealots, eventually expelled them from the city. The Sicarii were thrown out, not by Rome, but by their own people, because their tactics were too brutal even by the standards of a people already at war. There's another thing that Josephus records that almost never gets mentioned in the popular retellings. In 68 AD, the Sicarii at Masada launched a raid on a nearby Jewish settlement called Ein Gedi. They killed 700 people, women and children, their own people, Jews, for food and supplies. This is who was on that mountain. Which makes everything that follows considerably more complicated. By 70 AD, the Jewish revolt was effectively over. Rome's General Titus had put Jerusalem under siege, starved its population to the edge of cannibalism, and finally breached the walls. The Second Temple, the physical heart of Jewish worship, the holiest site in the ancient world, was set on fire. Whether by accident or by design remains debated. What isn't debated is the result. The temple that had stood for 6 centuries burned to the ground in a single night. Titus returned to Rome to a triumph. An arch was built in his honor that still stands in the Roman Forum today, showing Jewish prisoners carrying the temple's menorah through the streets of Rome. The war was over. Jewish organized resistance was crushed, except for the Sicarii, on their rock in the desert. In 72 AD, 2 years after Jerusalem fell, Rome finally turned its attention to Masada. Not because it had to, not because the Sicarii posed any genuine threat to Roman power. They were 960 people, including women and children, on a plateau in the middle of nowhere with no army, no navy, no means of expansion, and no realistic prospect of being rescued. Rome sent them anyway. The Roman governor of Judea, Lucius Flavius Silva, arrived at the foot of Masada with the 10th Legion, Legio Ex Fretensis, plus auxiliary units, and a large contingent of Jewish prisoners of war forced into labor. 15,000 men in total to take 960 people off a rock. Why? Military strategist Edward Luttwak, one of the most respected analysts of Roman strategy in the modern era, argued that the Masada campaign made no conventional military sense whatsoever. The deployment of an entire legion, plus auxiliaries, plus the enormous logistical effort of sustaining 15,000 men in the Judean desert. To eliminate a pocket of rebels who posed zero strategic threat, this was not a military operation. It was a message. The message was this: we will chase you to the edge of the world, we will spend whatever it costs, we will deploy whatever it takes. There is no mountain high enough, no desert remote enough, no position isolated enough that Rome will not come for you. Surrender now or surrender later, but surrender you will. Masada was not a siege, it was an advertisement. I want you to think about this and drop a comment because it genuinely changes how you see the whole story. If the Romans were sending a message rather than fighting a battle, does that reframe what the people on Masada were actually defying? They weren't just resisting Rome's army. They were resisting Rome's entire idea of inevitability. Is that more heroic or more tragic to you? Tell me in the comments. When Silva reached the base of Masada and looked up, he faced a problem that had no obvious solution. The fortress was genuinely impregnable to direct assault. The cliffs were unscalable under fire. The single pathway up the eastern face, a narrow, switchbacking trail the ancient sources called the Snake Path, was so tight that men could not walk up it side by side. A handful of defenders could hold it against thousands, and the western face, while less sheer, was still a near-vertical wall of limestone. A conventional siege, surrounding the fortress and waiting for starvation to do the work, wasn't viable either. Herod had thought of that. The cisterns held 40 million liters. The storehouses held enough for years. The Sicarii could potentially outlast the Romans simply by waiting. So Silva ordered something that, even by Roman standards, was extraordinary. He would build a ramp from the desert floor to the base of the fortress walls, a ramp up the side of a 1,300-foot cliff built in the middle of a desert in summer heat. Using Jewish prisoners of war as forced labor, a calculated cruelty, because the defenders on the walls above could not fire down on workers who were their own people without killing them. First, Silva encircled the entire base of Masada with a circumvallation wall, a stone wall nearly 2.5 miles long, connecting 8 Roman camps positioned around the mountain. Every possible escape route sealed. Then construction began on the ramp itself. The Romans identified a natural spur of bedrock on the western face, a geological accident that gave them a starting point roughly a third of the way up the cliff. From there, they built upward. Archaeological surveys have calculated that the ramp used something in the range of 14,000 cubic meters of material: stone, compacted earth, wooden beams for structural support. Tens of thousands of tons, carried by hand up the side of a cliff in desert conditions, built under the constant psychological pressure of nearly 1,000 people watching from directly above. It took months. Modern estimates suggest somewhere between 2 and 5 months for full completion, though construction likely created usable access before full completion. And here is the detail that makes Roman engineering feel almost supernatural. When the ramp was complete, the Romans didn't just walk up it. They built a siege tower, a movable iron-plated tower 60 feet high, mounted on wheels, and they pushed it up the completed ramp. Inside the tower, a battering ram. The defenders watched this rolling iron monster coming toward them up the side of their mountain, and did what any rational people would do. They built a second wall inside the first. A wall of timber and earth that could absorb the impact of the battering ram by flexing rather than breaking. Stone walls crack under battering. Wood and earth absorb the blow. It was a clever solution. Then the wind changed. Silva ordered his soldiers to set the wooden wall ablaze. The fire initially blew back toward the Roman position, a gust of wind driving the flames at the Romans themselves, threatening to ignite the siege tower. For a moment it appeared the desert itself was defending Masada. Then the wind shifted. The timber wall burned. The outer defenses of Masada were breached. The Romans prepared to assault in the morning. And that night, that single night between the breaching of the wall and the Roman assault, is the heart of the story. Or at least, what Josephus tells us is the heart of the story. According to Josephus, on the night of April 16, 73 AD, Eleazar ben Yair, the leader of the Sicarii, the man who had held Masada for 7 years, gathered his people for a final assembly. And he spoke. Josephus records 2 full speeches. Long, elaborately constructed orations in the style of classical Greek rhetoric, arguing that death was preferable to slavery, that the soul is immortal and the body merely its temporary vessel. That God had ordained this outcome, that dying free was more dignified than living as a Roman prisoner. The men, says Josephus, wept, some hesitated. Eleazar spoke again, and then they moved with purpose. Each man killed his family, his wife, his children. Then 10 men were chosen by lottery to kill all the remaining men. And finally 1 man, chosen by lottery from among the 10, killed the other 9, walked through the silence of the dead and took his own life. 960 people, one night. The Romans entered the next morning expecting battle. They found silence. Josephus writes that they were moved to admiration, not exultation. That they did not rejoice in the victory, but were struck by the nobility of the decision and the terrible sight of what they found. Now, let me tell you the problem. The 2 speeches Josephus quotes, those long, beautifully constructed philosophical arguments for choosing death, were reported to him by 2 women and 5 children who survived the night by hiding in an underground cistern. They could not have heard those speeches from inside a cistern, physically impossible. Josephus himself was not at Masada, ever. He was in Rome, writing under imperial sponsorship, when he composed the Jewish War. He had no eyewitness account of the final night. He had the testimony of 7 survivors who were hiding underground, and who, after giving Josephus the story, disappear from his account entirely. No names, no further mention, gone. And Josephus himself had a personal reason to understand this particular story well. At a town called Yodfat, 5 years earlier, during the siege that led to his own capture, Josephus had been one of the last survivors in an almost identical situation, a surrounded garrison. A debate about death over surrender, a lottery. In Josephus's account of that event, he was chosen last by the lottery and chose to surrender instead. Some historians have suggested that Josephus transplanted his own Yodfat experience onto Masada, rewriting himself as a man who chose surrender into a community that chose death. and giving the deaths at Masada the nobility his own survival perhaps lacked. This is the question I cannot stop turning over. If Josephus fabricated or heavily embellished the Masada story, does that make what happened there less meaningful? Or does the fact that the story endured, became a national myth, shaped a people's identity and a nation's founding psychology, does that give it a truth of its own? Regardless of what literally happened on that mountain. Tell me where you land on that in the comments, because I genuinely think this is one of the hardest questions in all of ancient history. In the 1960s, an Israeli archaeologist named Yigal Yadin led the first major excavation of Masada. Yadin was not just a scholar. He was a former general, the first chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, and a man for whom the story of Masada carried profound personal and national weight. What he found was extraordinary. The site was remarkably preserved. 2,000 years of dry desert air had protected food storage jars still containing dates, grains, olives, and wine. Fragments of Jewish scrolls, including portions of the Psalms, including passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls tradition, lay where they had been placed. Herod's palace tiers clung to the cliff face, their frescoed walls still faintly visible. A synagogue, one of the oldest ever discovered in Israel, sat near the northern wall. And then there were the pottery shards. Among hundreds of inscribed ostraca, ceramic fragments used as the ancient equivalent of notepaper, Yadin found 11 that were different from the rest. Small, written in the same hand, each bearing a single male name or nickname. One of them bore the name Ben Yer. Yadin announced that these were the lottery pieces, the actual physical objects used by the defenders to determine the order of killing on the final night. The pottery shard inscribed with the leader's own name, proof that Eleazar Ben Yer himself had participated in the lottery, had not exempted himself from the fate he was ordering for others. It was a story so compelling it became the centerpiece of the modern Masada myth, but modern archaeologists are considerably less certain. 11 pottery shards, found among over 700 at the site, grouped together by a single scholar because the names appeared to be written by the same hand. These same shards could have been food distribution tokens, ration markers, dividing Masada's stored food among its population. They could have been voting tokens. They could have been unrelated to the final night entirely. And there was something else Yadin found that his own report handled carefully: human remains. 25 skeletons in a cave on the southern cliff, pig bones nearby. Pig bones, an animal whose presence at a Jewish site, particularly at a site occupied by intensely religious sicarii, is deeply anomalous. These remains may have been Roman soldiers. They may have been later inhabitants. They may have been the Jewish defenders. Nobody knows. The story that emerged from Yadin's excavation was presented to the world as confirmation of Josephus. A heroic last stand, a noble death, proof of defiance. What it was, more honestly, was ambiguous physical evidence interpreted through the lens of a story that a nation desperately needed to be true. Here is what I think is actually the most important part of this entire story, and it's not what happened in 73 AD. In 1942, a Hebrew poet named Yitzhak Lamdan wrote a poem called Masada. It became one of the foundational texts of the early Zionist movement, a meditation on a people besieged on all sides, choosing to fight rather than submit, death before surrender. It was written in the shadow of rising European antisemitism, years before the Holocaust, by a man who could feel what was coming. After the Holocaust. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. After the early wars that threatened to destroy the new nation before it could take its first breath, Masada became something larger than history. It became a mirror, a story that an embattled people could look into and see themselves. Israeli paratroopers were taken to the summit and sworn in as soldiers under the words, "Masada shall not fall again." Archaeology expeditions to the site drew volunteers from across the world, thousands of people wanting to touch the physical ground of this story. A Hollywood miniseries in 1981. Countless documentaries, school curricula, national ceremonies, and then, quietly, uncomfortably, Israeli scholars began developing something called the Masada complex, a psychological concept. The idea that a nation so saturated with the story of a people who chose death over submission, might develop a dangerous tendency to see itself as perpetually besieged, to treat all threats as existential, to prefer terrible outcomes over the appearance of surrender. The myth that was built to give a nation courage began to be examined for whether it was also giving that nation something more dangerous. The psychology of a people who believe the only choices are victory or annihilation. This is what stories do when they become more powerful than facts. And yet, I keep coming back to the mountain, whether the speeches were real or invented. Whether the lottery pieces are lottery pieces or food tokens. Whether Josephus was recording history or writing propaganda for his Roman patrons. Whether 960 people died that night by their own hands, or by Roman swords, or by some combination of both. Something happened on that plateau on the night of April 16th, 73 AD. The Romans came in the morning and they found silence. The storerooms were intact, Herod's food still full. The message left behind deliberately: we had enough. We were not defeated by starvation. We were not broken by siege. We chose. Whatever actually happened, that message was real. The food left untouched was real. The silence that greeted 15,000 Roman soldiers was real. And Rome, which had sent an entire legion to make a point about inevitability. Rome, which had destroyed the temple and scattered a people and burned a city, Rome found, on a rock in the desert, that there were 960 people who had decided Rome's point did not apply to them. The message Rome sent with 15,000 soldiers got a reply. The reply was silence. Masada still stands. You can take a cable car to the top, it takes about 3 minutes. Or you can hike the snake path in the early morning before the desert heat sets in, which takes about 90 minutes and is, by all accounts, one of those experiences that changes something in you permanently. From the top you can see the Roman camps, the circumvallation wall, the outline of the ramp on the western face, still there after 2,000 years, still pointing upward toward the walls of a fortress whose defenders left no testimony of their own. We do not know what happened on that final night. We may never know. The only account we have is from a man who wasn't there, writing for people who wanted a certain kind of story. But I have been thinking about this for days, and here is what I keep coming back to. Maybe the uncertainty is the point. Maybe the reason this story has survived 2,000 years, has become a myth, a national symbol, a psychological archetype, is precisely because it leaves a space that every generation can fill with what it most needs. In 1942, a poet filled it with defiance. In 1948, a nation filled it with identity. In 1981, Hollywood filled it with drama, and today historians fill it with questions. The mountain holds all of it. That's what mountains do. If you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely. Because I think this is one of the most complicated stories this channel has ever touched. And the fact that you stayed tells me you're exactly the kind of person I make these videos for. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because the next video goes somewhere even darker and even more buried. And drop a comment before you go. I asked you 2 questions in this video. Tell me which one you're still thinking about, because I'm still thinking about both of them. I'll see you in the next one.